Hello, my name is Zachary Helmuth, and I am presenting my persuasive speech on why raising the minimum wage will benefit the economy. And just pan to everyone here. So, for most Americans, the thought of $7.25 is loose change, the cost of a single fast food item at some restaurants. However, $7.25 is what the United States has accepted as satisfactory minimum wage for everyone that has adopted the national minimum wage, excluding individual states. And this hasn't changed since 2009. And I can tell you the price of goods of everything in the economy has increased since 2009. The cost of living has been increasing at a higher rate than our wages, and it's becoming increasingly challenging for people to sustain themselves on minimum wage jobs. I specifically remember my first job in a mall in Southern California where I started at $10.50 an hour. And I know now we're starting people at Costco at least $14.50. Which I don't think is even a fair wage for today's cost of living. The federal minimum wage should be reconsidered and raised to help bring more of the lower class out of poverty, allow the lower middle class to catch up with the increasing living expenses, and incentivize more people to enter the workforce with a more competitive wage. The federal minimum wage is far too low and needs to be increased to help the lower and middle class Americans with the rising cost of living. According to Investopedia, minimum wage serves as a baseline wage that is intended to ensure workers receive fair compensation for their labor, covering basic living expenses. With the current federal wages being implemented in many states across the country, millions of Americans are struggling to survive financially with increasing cost of living and the cost of wages not meeting that. It has been a challenge for the public, especially with the pandemic, to meet the increasing cost of living and the cost of goods, and $7.25 nationally is far too short to cover any of that. The Center of Economic and Policy Research explains that minimum wage workers did the minimum wage, minimum wage workers make nearly 40% less than their 1968 counterparts if adjusted for inflation. It is worth about $12 today, which is still far less than what is acceptable to survive on. Our economy has fluctuated tremendously over the past few decades, and the current federal minimum wage is worth less than what it was in 1968. One thing I know for sure is groceries are not worth less than they were in 1968. A long-term solution for minimum wage would be to rise it slowly, to about $15 an hour over about 6 years. The Economic Policy Institute lays out a plan where the government does not raise the minimum wage initially straight to $15. It'll implement a plan where businesses can grow on to the new trend and adjust to the cost of employment for their current employees and the added on workforce. Rising the federal minimum wage to about $15 an hour would benefit the lower and middle class by bringing more families out of the poverty line and drive more people to enter the workforce. So if you look right here to the graph on the right, it has not been increased in about 15 years, like I said, since 2009. So as we hit 2009, we get a flat line here. And the line above it would be what minimum wage would be acceptable for the cost of living adjusted to inflation. And if you look at the two trends, they do not meet equally at all whatsoever. The highest point being here in about the 1970s, early 70s. And when we flatline here at about $7.25, the cost of living has not come down substantially and up until about here, which we're still dealing with difficulties now today. AmericanProgress.org shares that rising the minimum wage to about $15 an hour would allow members of the bottom 25% of white, black, Latino workers would see the annual wages increase about $6,000 a year. This would allow these families to start putting away for emergency funds, rainy day funds, etc., and start putting long-term investments into their children and the future workforce, which would, in the long term, benefit the economy. The Kellogg Insight shares an interesting point. Nicola Perisco, a Kellogg professor of managerial economics, States that higher minimum wage compensations likely drive some long-term economic benefits for the business. Productivity would increase over time for the lower level employees, the lower level performers as well, as they'd be incentivized to perform better and earn higher wages over a long period of time. Employee turnover can cost a company a lot annually, including training and hiring. It's about $10,000 per employee on average to train for payroll. So a company does care about turnover and hanging on to those lower performers if they're incentivizing them with higher wages. As we know, the minimum wage rate we currently have in place is too low for the current standard of living in the United States. So the graph on the left is another representation of where minimum wage has gone. The real federal minimum wage here is a line in the dark blue. The light blue is the projected minimum wage if we were adjusting for inflation, which is a terribly large gap, as we can see here, and it doesn't justify any of the cost of living that we're going through today. And the bottom line here, the projected if the minimum wage rose with productivity, is, like I said, not a clear representation of the cost of living here in the United States for what we would need to survive. So as you can see, minimum wage is nowhere near where we need to be if we're adjusted for the current inflation rate of today. So let's see. As we know, like I said, the minimum wage rate we currently have in place is too low for the current standard of living in the United States. And I listed out possible ways the government can implement a plan to slowly increase the minimum wage to about $15 an hour. We can fight for fair wages for hardworking Americans and achieve a livable minimum wage by contacting our local representatives, creating and signing petitions, and taking to social media with the severe impact that social media has today. With a fair minimum wage, we can bring families out of poverty one fair paycheck at a time. Thank you.